All right.
Perfect. I think we're
Awesome,
good.
awesome. Hello, class. Welcome to the session today. It's good to see you.
Everyone.
Virtually, anyway. I guess first things first, I just want to say great job on the last time I saw you and presentations in general. And I will announce it again at the end of class, but we're just discussing if you guys are looking for feedback on these sessions, please do use those office hours that are available to you guys to sign up and talk to me or talk to Tommaso for getting some critical feedback and also potentially scoping out some ways to move forward. And but yeah, so with that, yeah, congrats. Like I think you're all in a right way to go. Today's class is going to be a little bit more about some case studies and some focused kind of understanding of the holistic vision, really, of what Web3 might want to be about and how your dApp might fit into this, right? And how it could or should, maybe you don't want it to. So with that, I think I'll jump into some slides unless there's any specific questions anyone has before we get started. Throw something in the chat or speak it out loud. And if not, we can get going. And maybe I'll lean into Manon here to be able to pull things up and notify me if somebody has a particular question. Go ahead and interrupt me at any time, guys.
All Sounds good.
With that, I'm going to share my screen. All right. Y'all be seeing this? Make sure, yeah, looks like we're good. Cool. So today, we're talking about holistic Web3 and dApp architecture, right? So you guys give me some pitches on what your dApps are and what you aspire to do. Now let's take a step back and look at like, okay, how do we actually design these things in a way that fits into this new paradigm, this Web3 model thing? So circling all the way back to the first class, this is a slide out of there directly. And we're bringing up this idea of like, what does a blockchain do, right? A blockchain says once we confirm something on it, that ledger of this blockchain is recording is absolutely final. So this really fundamentally enables, right, an open database that we can trust without trusting anyone using it. Right. And I think that trust is really the key word that we can lean into here. And when you're designing these apps, kind of focusing on if we're building something in Web3, specifically with a blockchain or interacting with a blockchain, this trust thing really comes up over and over again, really. And it drives a lot of what we need to do in designing the architecture of our dApps to really fit with that trust model that we'll develop. Right. So before we go any further, though, it's like, do you really need a blockchain? Right. And because as I'm hearing some great pitches from you guys in class, a lot of these products, I wonder, like, do we really need a token? Do you really need to go and use a blockchain at all? Because, you know, I would not be a solution in search of a problem, right? So deciding that you really want to use NFTs to do this, it might make sense in the sense that we're building a dApp, so like you should use something that's blockchainy or whatever. But I would encourage you to really think deeply about that you're a problem that has a solution that happens to be with blockchain. So really meditate as you guys as a team, if you really do have something that's novel and innovative and actually providing value that cannot be expressed without blockchain, or at least is substantially reduced in terms of its impact without blockchain. Right. So really, yeah, it's focusing on that problem first that you want to solve, and then see if blockchain is the right fit for it. So it's a little bit backwards in the sense that we're later on in the development of this, but I think you'll make a much stronger pitch, understanding the context and giving motivation for it, even if it's not expressed directly in your pitch itself. But understanding it and grasping it when you're asked about it is really going to help. Right. And really, I want to encourage you guys to start thinking as well at this point in the game that bugs, right, with cryptocurrency especially, can result in huge losses, right? Like this DAO hack was one of the progenitors of all this stuff. And people talking about designing decentralized autonomous organizations based on these tokenomic models. Well, this thing lost a huge amount of all Ethereum that existed because there was a bug in the contract that was exploited, right? And unbelievable amounts of money have been lost all the time. You hear about these everywhere. So if you're designing something that's going on this blockchain, right? You can do some really things that are going to mess up your users, and potentially throw the thing all under a bus. So blockchain is a very tedious tool to use because it is kind of definitive, right? As we found out earlier, as we were talking about earlier, that once it's final, it's final. So we got to figure out and make sure that once we've written something and put this on the chain, that it's going to work as we expect. And I tell you again, thinking about, is blockchain the right tool? Blockchain is not a cheap thing to use, right? The blockchain's benefits really are definitely scaling it right now pretty much linearly with how much compute you want to do on the system, right? This is a great quote from Vitalik, right? That's a few years old now, but I think it's still on the right ballpark. Is that Ethereum is about 1,000,000 times less efficient for storage, network, and computation, and it's also about 1,000,000 times more expensive, right? Which kind of makes sense. Is I want to change a couple of entries in a database somewhere, and it costs me $10, $100, whatever it might be. It's a lot of money that I could do on a centralized database for a whole lot less. So why would I even think about using this thing? And it gets back to this idea of this trust model. If you don't want to trust some third party to potentially be doing the right thing by you, instead you can use code as law, right, to enforce these rules for you. So it's worth that 1,000,000 times overhead for that very specific thing that you don't want to entrust with somebody else, right? So there's plenty of methods to optimize. As you guys are probably discovering, we talked a little about an IPFS just a few classes ago, but off-chain storage, side chains, and potentially scaling X layers, so second, third layer solutions, are something that you should start to investigate now. As you're designing your application, then thinking about what is the absolute minimum viable thing that you can land on one of these things that costs 1,000,000 times more than something that could land on like AWS or Google Cloud or something like this. Really optimizing for that is going to save you and your users a whole lot of pain and headache, right? So let's say now you've gone through this and you said, okay, despite the bugs, despite all the cost, right, we do really want a blockchain, right? You might want it, but do your users? And a lot of your presentations, I do hear really cool stuff going on about like the presumption, though, that all of your users are potentially already involved in cryptocurrency, or might have some, or have some easy access to it, or notionally maybe there's like a fiat on ramp that will incorporate that. I wasn't hearing, at least at the time, any solid understanding of like how you're going to draw in non-blockchain people into your blockchain product necessarily, right? So something to consider, right? So you've really got to get buy-in from your users, and also if you're developing a platform that's not necessarily for the end cryptocurrency user, might be like a business-to-business operation. I think there's some of that in this group. They need to really understand and use it. And fundamentally, this all drives around this key management responsibilities. With great power comes great responsibility. You're offboarding a lot of this onto your users now, presuming that you're going to be using key cryptography, public key cryptography, to manage a lot of the account interactions, things like sending funds or proving an identity, right? And then this immutability thing we were talking about before. If you do something incorrectly, it could be really bad. Privacy, as we know right now, pretty much everything is public and totally transparent. And we'll dive in a little bit more into why that's important to consider in your application design later. And really, that access to cryptocurrency, I think, is the number one thing to think about in terms of your users for the context of things that you'd like to build. Because it's still a very small part of the population that has cryptocurrency and wants to use it, right? So I would encourage you guys, this is a link, you can look at these slides I shared here, and I think they might be on Slack, but they will be on Slack if they aren't yet. For the cryptocurrency statistics this year, it's like, in general, how many people own this stuff and what are they using it on? And is there a segment of the population that you think you could target that wants to spend crypto with you, if that's the angle you're going for? So all that said, right, blockchain is very likely in a lot of cases not the best solution, right? But what it can do that's really unique and novel, I think, it drives us all towards a robust, decentralized systems. So it's a much bigger picture, right? It's about technology solution, but it's also about society. Like, at least to me, it gets kind of sociopolitical. And I want to dive into that a little bit with you guys to give you a sense of kind of like this Web3 vision, right? So back in the beginning is like the why and how this whole Web3 thing exists, because it's systemic to a lot of why things are the way they are, and some of the trade-offs were made and why it is, for instance, so expensive to do this kind of stuff, at least for right now. Decentralization is really core to this, right? But this is not just technical, right? In the sense that we have servers all over the world and these nodes talking to each other for redundancy, reliability, and various other reasons. But it's also a bit sociopolitical, right? This really is kind of at the core of Bitcoin, is this idea that you're trying to reduce control and risk of abuses of power and potentially erroneous uses of that power, whether it's malicious or not. Being able to pull out the centralization of the power structures is really core to a lot of these technologies, at least what's inspired a lot of these technologies, whether or not it's still like the driving theme in that particular platform. Another really core thing here is self-sovereignty, right? Kind of in that same light with a sociopolitical decentralization, is that users are now more in control and resistant to such abuses of power and things like this. But it also puts a bunch more responsibility on the end users, like talking about key management in particular, but more than that, like think about scams, right? There's no authority to potentially go and report to in a lot of the crypto world. Why? Because no one can undo the things that you're the only one that's able to do in the world, right? And can't revoke them or undo them for you on your behalf. So it's a blessing and a curse, right? But it also can be something that's really important for providers. And something I would encourage you guys as dApp designers, being a provider of a service, is that you can potentially lean into this feature. You have much less liability potentially, and you have much less overhead and maintenance to maintain your dApp, right? It could potentially even run itself. The community can take this thing up and run the infrastructure for you and continue to develop it for you on your behalf, or I should say not for, with, right? Collaboration and things like this. So something to consider is this dual-edged sword can be great for both parties and potentially bad for both parties. And then another core tenet to really the whole Web3 vision is this idea of transparency and non-exclusivity. And what I mean by that, primarily in transparency, right, is an open public ledger. And it needs to be so that we can audit this stuff, at least for today, right? And non-exclusivity, meaning that we cannot stop you from interacting with this system, right? Anyone can interact, censorship resistant and permissionless, right? Ironically, though, there's this juxtaposition. That's why we have this star here with that you can exclude people from systems built on top of the system. But that's a really interesting topic that is probably out of scope for today. But to consider, a lot of your applications, you're building potentially closed gardens that have some administrative control. For instance, the example of a smart contract, right? You might have some whitelisting of people who can interact with this contract or issue NFTs or do this, that, or the other it might be. So you do build in on this permissionless, non-exclusive system, exclusive and potentially scarce things. So it is this really interesting double play, right? So separating out what needs to be totally transparent and non-exclusive versus potentially more private and hidden and more exclusive is important in your application design. Typically in the Web3 world, leaning more heavily into the transparency side is going to be easier to implement, first of all. And it's also culturally generally much more accepted. Specifically, open source and being able to publicly audit the data of contracts that people are getting into is something that everyone wants. So all that like picture in mind, in the rest of class today, I kind of want to dive into two things, and that's really decentralization from a more concrete stance, and open source again from a more concrete stance. So the why, right, of the dApps that we use for particular, the why of the tools that we use for particular, you're building your dApps, right, is what I want to dig into here. So like in building your application, right, you should be very considerate of the platforms and the tools that you're using and what kind of ethos and mission and vision and values these guys have, because this is for your team, but also the things that you're using. Because really having some alignment there is really going to help you here. It could be that when you're researching these partners and providers that you're going to be plugging into, for instance, picking Algorand or Polkadot or Ethereum or whatever blockchain that you guys actually launch on, is going to be important, especially in blockchains today, because the values that the token holders and users of these platforms already have are going to be imbued. These are your first users, right? So you're appealing to this market. Talking about your potentially target market, it overlaps very heavily, at least at the beginning, where you launch. So fundamentally, does it jive with the thing that you're trying to achieve? And also, does it jive with the users who are primarily already on the platforms that you're trying to use? Right? So yeah, something to consider. Little asterisk here is referring to that we do see a vision of Web3 evolving where there's easy, basically seamless transition between these little like siloed walls that people are in right now with different blockchains. So it could be that in the future, it's much easier to move through these barriers and have basically the whole Web3 universe have access to your application. But right now, they still are pretty siloed. Something to consider. Right. So then let's look at a case study. I don't know if anybody here in the class has heard of Shapeshift before. This is one of the original, I'd say OG DEXs, decentralized exchange, although it wasn't really a DEX, as we'll find out, right? What it really was originally is a non-custodial centralized exchange, right? And the ethos here was mission driven to be mostly for Bitcoin, and at the time it was Ethereum and some of these first tokens that were launching, a way to transact these with as little authority as possible, as little trust as possible, and as much self-sovereignty as possible for the end users. So a non-custodial exchange, for those who aren't aware, this is where these tokens are not actually managed by the backend, by this exchange. They don't hold your funds for you. You don't set up an account. Like Coinbase is a custodial exchange. You put in funds, you trade, and they actually custody all of the assets that are on there. You're allowed to withdraw them potentially. There might be limits, and there might be some KYC associated with that. Shapeshift's answer, or I guess retort to this, was no, we're not going to have any user counts, we're not going to have any KYC, and we're not actually going to hold any user funds. The only thing we do is hold a basket of funds that you can request to change for a price at a given, whatever price we'll quote you at. So this was not necessarily novel, but in the crypto space, it's definitely one of the most empowering things for people just getting onboarded. Because there's no accounts needed, these guys have a, I guess, first mover advantage. It's very easy for them to bring on new users because of the low friction barrier to entry and anonymity that that kind of thing can provide. So it's very popular. But well, what do you know? This is a US-based company, and so we had regulators come in to Shapeshift and really force. It's like you get to either enforce KYC in accounts and understand your users to make sure you're not doing money laundering and all this stuff, or we're going to shut you down. So this forced their hand. They needed to bring this on. There was a huge amount of backlash. I would encourage you to go and read some of the articles around this. Shapeshift CEO Eric Voorhees gives this message basically, and a little bit ominous tone, I think back in 2019. But so here they had to go from a permissionless self-sovereign platform to now it's a permissioned and account-based platform, and it restricted the assets they had access to. So moving forward, progressing, right? These guys then went to a new phase where they're saying, okay, well, we have to deal with these regulations, at least for now, and accounts are a thing. So let's introduce some rewards. In fact, let's introduce a Fox token is what they ended up doing that's associated with their platform. You're just accruing it. It doesn't really have any notional value. They want to see what people like for they're accruing something potentially, right? Tokens like you see POAPs, similar in theme. Here they're fungible tokens associated with using the platform, right? So it's trying to encourage you to continue to use this thing. So this is the progression so far. But then they take a pretty radical shift, which I think is important for everybody to keep an eyeball on. I know I'm keeping an eyeball on this because it's rapidly evolving now. So Shapeshift is changing from this exchange model and has now moved more towards a proper decentralized exchange, so a DEX, right? And it's not even itself providing this DEX. It's a tooling platform for interacting with specifically a Thorchain DEX. So, and on top of that, they're becoming a DAO. So this is really the interesting change, is they've gone from this totally centralized model, now moving into a token governed decentralized autonomous organization, and actually are dissolving their company to let the community start to run this thing and take over the direction and vision and mission and potentially the active development of this, all through careful design of tokenomics, right? So they airdropped a bunch of tokens to all of their users. This was through using the interacting with the platform, this Fox token that everyone was accruing. But also, as they're making this big announcement, dropped a lump sum to get everybody very excited and to start liquidity mining and pooling on this Fox token to give it some notional value, right? So I won't get into the depths of the tokenomic design here, but I would go and check out kind of what they were doing and why they designed the tokens the way that they did. And here now, instead of being a manager of money and actually having this pool of funds that they're exchanging on your behalf, they're using Thorchain, which is a DEX in and of itself. And they're just the operating tool to be able to talk to Thorchain and to do what you need there. So there's no KYC again, there's no account required. And this, in this case, there's no regulatory restrictions on assets. It's whatever exists on Thorchain. So this has kind of been an interesting progression, right? From decentralized but centralized backend all the way out to a much more decentralized thing, right? So it really has come a long way from its origins, and there's still potentially problems here, right? Is that Shapeshift is still the central backend hosting a single site for you. So it could be compromised. It could be malicious, right? So for instance, OpenSea is the article I've linked here, where you might have heard of people faking OpenSea to go ahead and steal some credentials where it looks and feels just like OpenSea. Or potentially even OpenSea itself could become malicious from the inside. Someone changes stuff to be able to compromise keys and sign things that you shouldn't, right? So using this front end, you're trusting that they're asking you to sign things that are correct and not lying to you about the things that they're reading off the chain, stuff like this, right? And because the site is centralized, it could go down, right? And not all of this is public open source material still. And it's not all self-hostable, meaning that I can't run the Shapeshift platform on my own machine if they just decided to go dark tomorrow, right? The DAO helps a lot against this though, right? This is potentially, you have a large community that's evolving around this to help support it and maintain it and bring it more into light and open source. But so why did I give you a whole talk on this Shapeshift thing, right? I think it's really curious to look especially at the DAO model, but the key point to me in this is that centralization of Web3 isn't necessarily a bad thing. The ethos and the culture is like very demanding that you're as decentralized as possible. And I think that's a good thing to aspire for. But we really need to be, as dApp designers, identifying the key aspects of what we're making that must be trustless, right? Is that we need to strive to maximize this trustlessness, but we also need to really balance what are the development needs for us, right? What's the overhead to make this happen for us, and the user experience that we need, right? So one of the key terms here that I would encourage you to go in and do some research on your own as well is progressive decentralization, right? So as you're maturing, much as Shapeshift did, they had to go through some different phases, right? And it started very centralized and has now moved even more decentralized. And I think there's still a ways to go. I think eventually some of the problems that we were just talking about could dissolve, and this would really be a permissionless thing that lives out effectively in the ether somewhere and that anyone could use, right? No accounts required. All you need is a key and some crypto, and you can use this thing, right? So this fully realized decentralized vision could be in their future, but they really have to push hard to get it there. And it's not an easy task for anybody, for your development team or for your users, at least for now. Okay, so changing gears a little bit, right? That's Shapeshift. I guess maybe I should first off take any questions. If there's any questions from the audience. Anybody? If not, that's cool. All right. So jumping back a little bit, the other bit. So that's kind of the talk I wanted to focus on decentralization, right? Now we really want to focus on this open source thing, right? And open, potentially radically open more than just your source code. A little bit about your company's operations and all this stuff might be in this loop. But to begin with, right, what is open source? You guys may or may not be familiar. This allows you specifically to view the code, maybe to edit it yourself, in the sense they can't stop you from editing it on your own machine, but publishing those edits somewhere. You might be able to run it. There might be restrictions on running this, where you can, who can operate it. Maybe you can't at all. And I would stress that open source is not free, right? This takes time and effort and sweat and all kinds of money to be able to support this, but it is effectively a common good. We'll dive into what that means a little bit more in the context of Web3, but just keep that in mind. Like, all this stuff that we're using, everyone's benefiting from it, and it is generally a universal positive to have it out there, but there's pros and cons for it, right? So this is critically important, in almost everything in the Web3 context is open source, as opposed to closed source, where you cannot inspect any of the stuff that's going on at all, because of this decentralization, so that anyone can potentially run the software out in the world, or at least audit it, right? So security for yourself, for understanding what the program is doing, but also potentially security in the sense that everyone else can audit and give you some feedback as to if things are exploitable or not. And resiliency in the sense, if it's out there in the world for other people to take up, they might be able to improve it and publish back those codes upstream to you. Right? But as it's not free, right? How do we sustain open source, right? How do we actually go about getting the funds and the energy and the people that we need to continue to maintain this product, right? And I'd say that some of the things that are happening in Web3 that are pretty exciting and kind of exclusive here is, so sponsorships are a thing. We see Patreon, but increasingly in the Web3 exclusive world, we have things like Gitcoin. And if you haven't seen Gitcoin, this is a bounties platform and a grant platform and a hackathon platform. Their mission is to sustain open source. What do you know? And they're doing all kinds of wonderful things as a case study to go and look at what's possible out there to fund Web3 development and to source new people to potentially help work with you. And then foundations are definitely an important part here, as we're finding out, like from the Algorand Foundation and the Web3 Foundation and the Ethereum Foundation. All these guys have a lot of incentives to try and help you guys sustain the open source model, because they kind of depend on it, right? All of these platforms really need this to succeed. And traditional funding, I think that I can lean more into Tommaso's expertise here, but we're aware that like equity bonds and things are out there in the world. The hard part with traditional funding, and especially in the context of open source, is that all your funders are going to be asking is, well, what's going to stop your competitors from taking this thing over, right? Like, they're so used to a closed IP model, right, in the sense that you have something that can't just be taken away and used somewhere else, right? And then these revenue models can be really hard, because someone, again, could just operate your source code somewhere else potentially. So is that going to undermine all the operations you're putting in, right? So a great example here, linked in the slides, Red Hat basically is one of the largest open source companies in the world that is sustainable. It is making a decent amount of revenue, and how they do it and why they do it is put into question here. And the proposition is that maybe open source companies like Red Hat cannot exist in this traditional funding model moving forward, or at least it's really, really hard to. So then another Web3 exclusive, right? Really diving into this, tokenomics. So the new innovative thing that really has been a game changer is the ability to issue tokens and design tokenomic systems around your product, whatever it might be. right? So this can be pretty simple. Like the progenitor of all this is the initial coin offering, or the ICO, which looks and feels very much like equity sales. Although depending on which regulator you talk to, that probably is not a thing you should call it. But you can sell tokens, right? And the users might want it for various reasons, right? And it depends, I think, regulatorily. And I'm not the legal guy to talk to, but you should talk to a legal guy if you're going to sell tokens, a guy or gal or whoever. You really need to take into account the regulatory environment around how you market these, right? What are the promises associated with them, right? Are they a utility token, meaning that this is something that will give you access to the platform, or are they actually just equity, meaning I'm giving you some dividends from the revenue streams that come out of this in some way? A little bit more off topic, but that's something to potentially look into. The next, I would say, phase of this is not launching and selling directly to people, but doing an initial DEX offering, or decentralized exchange offering. So here, instead of directly holding and being the central authority over all this token, you will put in a liquidity pool, which we'll get into here in a minute with Uniswap as a case study, a whole bunch of funds that are matched by some value-bearing asset and your tokens, and people can start trading against these, right? And they can also do things like liquidity mining and yield farming and all these things that you might have heard of in DeFi, to really lean into some of the gamified mechanisms that draw people in and potentially can drive the engine which can sustain your endeavors, right? So I would say that token engineering, if you guys haven't checked it out, has a great set of resources that help you grasp some of the concepts that go into this, and some of the design principles that really are novel, right? Because this looks and feels and is able to do different things than you can have with traditional equity in the past, or any other crowdfunding or whatever source, because of these interesting mechanisms. So it's definitely worth looking at. But then back to this idea, like, can you compete in open source, right? It's really easy to copy pasta stuff, right? So this business logic, at least on chain, really does need to be auditable. There might be some asterisks with zero knowledge tech out there in the world where you could have chains that, or you could have smart contract logic that is actually opaque to everyone, but you can validate that it's doing what you think it's doing, and only that. But that's definitely outside the purview of this class, and it's still a pipe dream. So right now, it needs to be on out open source, so people can at least read it, and this leaves it open to be stolen, right? Somebody else can deploy whatever your logic is on their platform or on the same platform and just bring people to theirs, right? So it's really critical to understand, what are you able to guard against in that, right? I would say that tokenomic systems are the things that I would lean into if you can design it that way, so that it really impedes a competitor coming in and potentially taking over your market share, whatever you're building, right? So let's look at then Uniswap, right? So this is a novel invention, an automated market maker. So I won't get into it too much here. I've linked a video, I believe it's in the next slide, that talks a little bit about the history of Uniswap and a little bit more about the details, technical details, like what this thing does. It's really cool. But it allows you to swap without a central provider of any kind other than this particular contract. So you're able to have a two-sided marketplace that develops with no middleman, no authority. It's quite literally a single contract that's able to exchange any token for any other token, right? So it's worth studying if you're interested in that. This is originally in the V1 phase, self-funded, and then eventually became consensus funded. It was one of these foundations came in and were able to support a completely open source project. Remember, this has no, it's a very unrestricted license. I think it was MIT. I could be wrong. But a very copyleft, or very close to copyleft, in terms of anyone can use this contract. It's just something that was deployed out there in the world. And then version 2 has come along, right? And this introduced a whole bunch of new features. And what it came with it was a whole bunch more interest in what this technology was doing. So VCs came in and they started making investments to help grow the team and to fund further development, which eventually birthed version 3 of the Uniswap protocol. And this introduced some totally new paradigms, and it gets much more complicated on the technical level we don't need to get into. But this also introduced their token launch, right? So there's a Uniswap token out in the world, and there's some backstory to this. Like, why does this thing exist more than just for the purposes of DAO? That the Uniswap has a DAO behind it now. So SushiSwap, you might have heard about this, or you might have seen this if you've been known in the I guess automated market maker space at all, because Uniswap is a progenitor here. SushiSwap comes in and produces a vampire attack, right? So they effectively took most of the code base of Uniswap, a lot of the principles there that were under this very permissive license in V2, and they added on top of this incentive, a tokenomic system to draw users over to SushiSwap. So I won't get into the technical details there, but it was very effective. They took in the order of, I think it was just a few weeks, the vast majority of the pooled funds that were on this decentralized exchange of Uniswap over to SushiSwap, right? So around this time, this really pushed and motivated Uniswap to have something to draw people back. So kind of stealing a little bit back from the SushiSwap side, introduced a token of their own with similar reward structures, and so now, even to this day, there's ongoing disputes and tensions between these teams, and between effectively the crowds that decide one is better than the other for whatever reason. Right? But this also motivated not just a tokenomic shift to try and defend their product. They introduced a license that is much more restrictive and actually makes it effectively illegal, at least under the jurisdictions that can come after you, to run this without their permission effectively on some platform. So if you're interested, this article linked here in this slide is worth a look, to go and see what kind of restricted open source license they are using to try and stop things like more vampire attacks happening in the future. So I would say it's very clear. Most everyone would agree open source is a net positive. It benefits the whole ecosystem. But man, it is a dual-edged sword, right? Especially in the context of startup world, right? Where you are building something that's novel and new, and that might just be the idea to begin with, at the very beginning, right? So designing systems that consider your competitors, especially early on, is very critical to your success. So that's for you to do your do your due diligence and understand who your competitors are already, because I think that a lot of the teams here are working on projects that exist in a marketplace that has some people already in it. And if you're thinking it's something novel, right, or you're adding something that's the business logic that needs to be public is the novel part, really understanding how you can make sure that you're going to succeed is important. So I think that's it for me, guys, in terms of what I wanted to talk about today explicitly. So I wanted to take some questions if you guys had any, and then we can jump back into like some announcements and some closing thoughts.
Okay, yeah, Dan, we have one class. Okay, I don't have my phone connected today, but I'll just turn my camera. There we go.
Hey guys.
I had a question. So you mentioned tokenomics. We've talked about. How do you go about designing smart tokenomics, considering like VC funding is more and more common, and like you don't want a lot of centralization, but you also don't want to dilute your funding level. So is there a smart design that you have in mind while designing tokenomics?
So I guess maybe the question is twofold in the sense that tokenomic design, I don't know if I have a one size fits all in terms of what should work for you, but interacting with the VC side of stuff, notionally a lot of people are going to want to get in on this token in some way, right? So it's structured in such a way that there is a cutout for investors in some kind, and maybe for the core team. I think in one of those slides it had like a model of tokenomics, like as just an example pie chart. Gives you a sense of where people are dividing things up. Are those percentages the right ones? Maybe, maybe not. And vesting periods and things like this are also important to consider. but I'm definitely not a financial advisor, and I'm definitely not somebody who knows the explicits of the deal flow for these guys. So unfortunately, I wouldn't want to advise you more than to go and check out this token engineering in particular. They've got a lot of great resources to understand kind of the context of what people are building already out there in the world, and maybe some tooling to help you evaluate what would make sense for you. So
Okay.
I'd
Thank
say one thing to also consider in general is that the dilutive factor, right, is very much up to you guys, right? You could be going after this model that is like this fixed cap Bitcoin-esque model where it's totally scarce, or it could be uncapped. You guys can do more of like a series model and decide what's appropriate there to issue more tokens. And what those tokens actually do and what they're ascribed to is important, because it doesn't just
Sorry.
have to be equity. It could be plenty of other things that you're giving utility, for instance, to your token here. So something to consider.
you. Thank you.
Sure.
Cool. Yeah. Any of you guys other questions?
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
If not, I think we can do announcements real quick. Maybe I'll bring my slides back up one more time.
Yes.
And I'll speak to these just a little bit. So office hours on Slack, and I believe the announcements explicitly, there's some links for my Calendly, and I think Tommaso has one on there as well. Sign up for these. I would really like to talk to each team at least once in the next few weeks to get a sense of where you guys are at, technically speaking, and from some of this architecture stuff, so we can scope a little bit more in the lower level details about what you're building. And I'm not going to give you a handheld solution. I think you guys are doing great in what you're up to, but I hope I can steer you around some potential foot guns and things like this. And then feedback from the first pitch. So please, again, do sign up for those office hours, and we can discuss what at least my take on it and potentially Tommaso's take independently on it. So then, yeah, Manny, I don't know if you had a few things to say.
Yeah, so particularly, some of the other things that are pretty important is our second pitch is going to be in 2 weeks on April 12th from today. So we kind of have like today's class session next week, and then we'll have our next pitch on Tuesday. And then we're going to have our final pitch on 5 weeks on April 28th. And then finally, basically the team who is kind of the highest selected from our class will kind of move on and compete in the Collider Cup, which is held on the week after during Dead Week on Friday, May 6th. So that'll be really exciting, and we're really looking forward to all of the projects and things you guys have been working on. So essentially just continue to develop your prototype as well as work on the MVP and other things, especially incorporating feedback from the pitch. So yeah, those are our main announcements. And I think, Dan, this would be a great opportunity to kind of jump out into the breakout rooms.
Yeah.
And then, and then we can also, have some people in class talk around as well.
For sure. Yeah. So I think we'll end the session here then, and we should definitely go and hang out in the lounge. I'll go and find a room or hop around some teams who are looking for something.
Yeah, this would be a great time to kind of work on and get feedback from Dan or kind of decompress stuff from the lecture. So we really wanted to include this good like 30 minutes to get some more time to work on stuff during class.
Rock on, guys. We'll see you in the lounge.